Appreciate the opportunity to share some of our science with you. A lot of great talks, and it's great to be here back in Gunnison and sharing some of our science. This work that I'm going to present to you today is an amalgamation of three different ongoing projects. So we're going to talk about really habitat conservation for Gunnison sage grouse. So the focus on seasonal habitats first in the satellite populations, then habitat improvement potential, and future threats. So Joanne, Jess, and Nathan have been instrumental in leading these analyses. So I'm going to share some of that with you today. So first, just talk with you about, we've seen these maps, the different satellite populations. Kathy has better figures, more recent, that you see in the bottom left. Just highlight the fact that these satellite populations are declining, numbers continue to go down, and we're really concerned with trying to manage these populations. The difficulty is that most of the resource selection analysis and understanding the conditions that the birds require comes from greater sage grouse or from the Gunnison Basin population. These satellites are unique and different. As those of you in the room know, the habitat conditions vary across each of these individual satellites. What the bird's using very likely varies. And if you just look at this quick chart showing habitat conditions with the variables on the left here from shrub cover, sagebrush cover, across 5 of these satellites, you can see I've highlighted variation in those on the average conditions that exist. So the availability of the resources to these birds is drastically different. So what are they using and how are they making a living on the landscape? So our question really here is what's important to these birds? Where are they using these landscapes? Where is it deprived maybe, and how do we improve these landscapes or habitat conditions for these birds to be successful? So I'm going to focus today, we don't have demographic data like Pete's described to you. This is purely based on resource selection and conditions and improving habitats. Just a caveat there. So our objective is to develop really a data-driven approach that allows us to put together a modeling framework that could support management actions across all these satellite populations. First project I'll talk about is modeling and mapping seasonal habitats for those satellites. Then we'll move into assessing where and how potential management actions might actually aid in improvement, again focused on all the satellite populations. And then finally, we'll move into analysis of assessing threats and where those might exist, because we don't want to invest millions of dollars in improving habitats that are likely to be gone in the future. So to do this analysis, we partnered with CPW and were able to obtain all of their telemetry data from 1991 to 2016. This slide's fairly busy here, but just want to draw your attention to the fact that there's some populations where we had limited data and we're unable to develop models for some of those satellite populations. But this is male and female data to try to look at resource selection, focused on the breeding season, as well as the late summer brood ring. So we took, I don't have time to get into the methods today, but I'm just going to highlight the approach we took, and then we'll go right into sharing some of the results. We used accumulated locations for use across the entire population of the individuals, and we considered availability across the entire population within each satellite. Given we've done work in the past in the Gunnison Basin and illustrated how sage grouse select habitats hierarchically, first choosing a landscape to occur in, and then make choices to where to go, whether it be nest or to raise their young, and individual food choices or bites on where to occur on the landscape. We took this hierarchical approach, again, modeling landscape conditions at large scales. And then within that, we identified where birds were going across the landscape. And we then did a second analysis, which to look at patch scale. So what are the choices where birds end up in different patch dynamics across the landscape? And these are focused on smaller scale conditions, less than 1 kilometer. That allowed us to, at both the landscape and the patch scale, focus on what are the drivers of the conditions that the birds are selecting and making these hierarchical choices. And we can make predictions to see the response curves for those. I'll show some examples for both of those for one population, but we're going to focus on the patch scale when we get back to the management, because management doesn't occur typically across an entire landscape. So in general, what we saw is there were similarities in what birds are using. Obviously, sagebrush is important, but they differ across those individual satellite populations. The influence of those variables also varied across seasons and at different scales. So that can affect how you may choose to implement habitat actions in one subpopulation versus the other. Understanding that's very important. Scale and context really matters. So these features have different scales of influence in the choices what the birds are making, and they vary across those populations. So we could see selection for sagebrush at a 30-meter extent, or we can see avoidance of roads at 1 kilometer up to 6 kilometers away, and that matters, and it makes a difference on if you're going to maintain and improve habitats, but you've got a bounce back effect in a certain population where birds are not going to go there. Don't waste your time and energy trying to improve that if you got some other effect that's happening. So what I'm going to do is focus on, for this initial example, I'm going to walk you through the models on the resource selection for the landscape and the patch, looking at the Crawford population here, just one for an example. So what we can do is we can take a final model and we can make a map like we've seen over the last few days with Pete's work and Shauna's, and we can map this across the landscape. This is the Fish and Wildlife Service critical habitat extent. We've got the CPW extent, which is stippling, which will stay consistent across these areas, and that's where the birds occur today, and we use the availability within that range. We've applied the model to the entire extent for purposes of conservation and management. So what goes into this model? What we can see, this is the landscape scale model for breeding season for birds in Crawford. You can see, not surprisingly, a positive response of probability of occurrence, relative occurrence on the y-axis. On the bottom, this is sagebrush cover within a 3-kilometer radius. The more sagebrush you have, the more likely birds are to be there. We also see the classic hockey stick model effect at the landscape scale of forest cover within 1 kilometer. Once you get about 10, 15, 20%, you see rapid declines and birds avoid those areas. So obviously, we know these populations are isolated into small geographic areas, but they're not along these edges where the forest edges occur. And then, not surprisingly, for mesic habitat proportion at very large landscapes, during the breeding season, sage-grouse aren't moving into these wet mesic areas. They like moderate amounts of the landscape to be in these mesic habitats. What we can do is we can apply this model and we threshold this to look at, well, where do 95% of all of those birds occur during the breeding season? Again, I'm showing here the CPW extent where this is mapped to, and that green outline, that's the concentration of 95% of the locations within the Crawford population of where they occurred. And this is where we say, okay, if the birds are already living in this landscape, what are they making choices at a finer scale for these patches? And we can evaluate the conditions that they choose within that. And so this is where the patch model is now applied to give a finer resolution of depicting the resource conditions within that landscape that the birds are choosing. And we can go through a similar process. Sagebrush is important still, even though we've seen it at a landscape. They still like these patches during the breeding season that have more sagebrush. They're further from forest edge. Even though we've seen avoidance of large patches of sagebrush, they still stay further away from any forest edge at a local scale. Excuse me. And in terms of mesic habitat at the patch scale, there's not really any strong avoidance or selection. It doesn't really make a difference. They're not selecting wet areas. And then for the conifer juniper, this one's a little bit interesting. Don't forget, we've avoided these, but we see conifer juniper. This is of less than 4%. So we're looking for these small intrusions of PJ that's coming down into the area. And birds tend to not worry too much if it's really, really low portion of less than 4% conifer juniper. Once you get about 5-10%, it starts to decline and they avoid those areas. So this gives us mechanisms of understanding the choices that these birds are making. So if we could remove some of these things that are threatening habitats or enhance things that improve habitats, where would that be most effective on the landscape? Just to summarize, so we did this across breeding, we did this across summer. These are the models and the maps predicted at the 3 different scales. These maps can be used for conservation and management. Not to dive into this, but this is essentially the responses we see for each of those covariate conditions across the different life stages, the landscape and patch scale for Crawford, and we did this for every satellite population. I don't have time to show you all of these, but what I want to do is move on to the next piece. How do we manage these landscapes? So let's move to a different population just for illustrative purposes. We're going to go to San Miguel, and we're going to look at the habitat management actions. This is work that Jess Shivers has done. So we have a model, just like we've talked before. We've modeled the landscape. I'm not showing you that here. Here's the landscape extent, and this is our patch model, just like I showed you with Crawford, increasing habitat quality in green across the occupied extents. And these are the patch breeding model where we're looking at habitat quality. What we can do, we're trying to ask is if we apply different management actions in different areas, can we effectively improve the suitability of this habitat, and where do we get the best bang for our buck? So where would we be best to apply these management actions and which ones? So again, we're taking that patch model on the left, and what we can do is we can evaluate through simulations a suite of different actions on the landscape. So it might be, let's improve sagebrush habitat. Let's grow more sagebrush on the landscape. Maybe we're taking this intruding PJ down into the sagebrush ecosystem, and we're removing that, taking away those threats. Can we enhance the habitat conditions or the quality? Can we treat cheatgrass and move these invasives from the landscape? What about some of these non-sagebrush shrubs that in some populations they may be making use of those, and others they may be avoiding those, as is the case here. And then what about improving mesic conditions across the landscape? And for the mesic, we only evaluated these obviously at typically at the late summer broodering, because it's supposed to improve those habitats, and it should. So what we can do is then take this and apply a simulated context on the landscape and look at the changes in the suitability by applying any one of these management actions on the landscape. I don't have time to get into the full details of these, but example on the mesics, we took the TNC's suitable areas where they could apply some of these mesic structures, and we simulated building those on the landscape and looked where they would have the most benefit in improving the late summer broodering habitat. So again, just focusing on one population here, what we're looking at is differences. Each of these panels shows differences in the different management action that might be applied. So I'm going to walk you through the color scheme here. The black colors depict across the range that it remains as non-habitat. We couldn't improve the conditions by applying that specific management action in that area across the population. The gray indicates, well, if we do that, we see a negative change to the habitat suitability for that particular life stage. What we can do is you can say, I'm just going to walk you through this example here, is take a look. If we apply these mesic improvements across the San Miguel population in the designated places that are targeted as likely to be positive, we can see massive improvements in summer habitat and create a total of 5 square kilometers of existing habitat, while 34 square kilometers of habitat had improvements in that late summer broodering habitat. So we can walk through each of these and evaluate these on where the best place would be to apply these dollars. When we've got limited conservation dollars, what this allows us to do is say, we can target areas that are likely to benefit sage grouse at this specific life stage and improve the habitat quality, which should theoretically improve population success. We can flip this map around as well and just map this. I've done this a different way to show habitat that's been created. And this outlines all the blue areas where invoking that management action can actually create new habitat that's likely to be used by Gunnison sage grouse. So we see this as a decision support tool. It's an adaptive management framework that can take the seasonal habitat models, assess and evaluate effectiveness of potential management actions on the landscape. This can be used to evaluate those and decide where and when and what should be applied. So this should theoretically increase the improvement of the benefits of those management actions on the landscape. So what I want to do is shift focus to the last piece here. We can go and apply these management actions in any given place in the landscape, but if they're not likely to be there in 30 or 40 or 50 years, is it worth trying to apply those if we're likely to lose them based on future threats? So what Nathan did is we took the species status assessment, and when they described 3 different future scenarios: optimistic, continuation, or pessimistic, and based on climate scenarios and fire and future development. And we've created basically spatially explicit projections for each of those based on 10 different data sets, and projected those to 2070 for Gunnison sage grouse across the range. So these include shifting climatic conditions that can change in vegetation, drying of mesic habitats, expansion of PGA encroachment or invasive exotic annual grasses, also development, future potential development based on some simulated models that project that, and then risk of wildfire happening, which obviously can have cascading effects for exotic invasives. So I'm very briefly going to walk you through what we're showing here. So essentially what we have in the dark red colors are existing conditions. That's a proportion of the landscape we're showing across each of the populations. And the dark red indicates fully degraded or non-habitat. So we're looking at sagebrush here in the dark red, or it's essentially 0% sagebrush cover on the landscape in the given population. So this is the status of what you have based on the dark red, or the light red in this case for sagebrush is less than 5% sagebrush cover. What I'm showing you here is the potential threats based on these simulations and how much the likelihood of there's a threat in any of these populations to lose what proportion of the habitat, the sagebrush habitat, due to the accumulated threats. And so the orange colors indicate that there's a partial risk or that they're always at risk, and the light yellow orange colors indicate that there's a potential risk in some of these simulations. So it's not always the same. What we can do is we can compare these for the different risks across all the populations. You can see that music resources, there's obviously not a lot of music resources on the landscape based on the amount of red that you see here. And there's only a moderate threat, sometimes at risk in the future for some of the music resources. The biggest threats tend to occur clearly based on the PGA and the invasive annual grass, where we see massive increases projected by 2070 across most populations for those two invasive species. Development, a little bit varied, and we see wildfire. There's huge risk of wildfire, particularly in the western portion or the western populations due to the drier climates and risk of fire coming in. So what we can then do with this is map these scenarios. I have the optimistic on the top, the continuation on the bottom left, and the pessimistic on the right to the landscapes. And what you can see is that we can look at the Serial Sims summit population. This is the most at risk based on those yellow to reddish colors within that. So the most amount of threats occur within this particular population into the future. We can go look at the San Miguel population, the Dry Creek, particularly in the most, some of these different scenarios, we see different amounts of threats that occur. This is mainly due to fire threats. It's also due to agricultural potential and cultivating lands. Ending on a somewhat positive note, like Pete talked about, maybe there's some hope in that we look at the Gunnison Basin. The threats are relatively lower risk towards the Gunnison Basin population, suggesting that this is, again, going to be our likely stronghold for Gunnison sage grouse if we indeed have one. So just to summarize, we looked at resource selection and occurrence across the landscape to identify suitable habitats. We were able to identify these. These relationships vary. It's important to consider those when we're considering management and identifying core areas within those populations we want to maintain those habitats. We did assess potential management improvements. We saw variation across these, but there is the possibility, if applied in the right place, in the right management actions, we can enhance the quality, which would probably result in a greater use by sage grouse, which should benefit those populations. We also assessed the future threats, and these will affect these existing habitats, and we need to consider those if we're going to spend millions of dollars of resources, and it's going to take millions, if not more, to apply to these landscapes to try to improve these habitats. So that'll just wrap up, and thank a lot of people that helped out with this work, supplied, supported data, contributed, and the funders associated with the process. Thank you. Kathy?
Thanks, Kim. I have a question. When you're modeling the how the management actions or treatments are modeled. So, for example, you have a mesic habitat treatment in the example you showed. Are you modeling a footprint of where that treatment occurred, or some kind of a buffer zone? Because something like the mesic habitats or the mesic restoration projects are, small one rock dam, but the functional habitat change is very different.
Good question. So essentially what we're doing is we've taken the TNC identified places that would be suitable to actually implement some sort of mesic restoration project. And then we've taken the area that would be influenced and identified those, and we've simulated changing that to mesic resource conditions. And then we're reapplying our habitat suitability models to identify how the condition would change on the landscape and how mesic habitats would affect typically that late summer broodering habitat, and seeing the bump in the quality. And then if that bumps to the level that birds are likely to use it, that's where we change in that blue map to created new habitat. We also evaluated the benefit in the change in the value, but then we can look at that. And we've, in this case, we've essentially simulated, let's go through the mesic process and create mesic habitat in all those identified places and see which has the best benefit. So for each of those conditions, it's similar like chopping down pinyon juniper, taking it out on the landscape, and then rerunning the models and looking at the consequences. Yeah. Amy's got one.
One more.
Good on time.
Cam, I just had a follow-up question on that.
Yep.
So you're basing it just on bird use, but it could be that those music habitats are creating a higher density of insect communities or something else important
Correct.
to the sage-grouse that can't really understand
We
that.
don't have the
with that.
mechanism modeled
Okay.
in this yet. And so
Okay.
ideally what would happen is you'd say, okay, can we create those habitats? When birds go there, much like Pete's presented, do we see increased production? We see changes in abundances in numbers, and we can build those into a demographic consequence as well. We don't have those data at this point to do that.
Thanks.
Good question.